The Knights Templar is the subject of many mysteries. Like, did they find the Holy Grail? Or the Ark of the Covenant? That stuff is all speculation, but what if I told you there was evidence to support that they knew full well of North America, and artifacts we find in America support them having made this journey? Let's get into it. So I'm sure you already know the story of the Knights Templar. They were formed in Jerusalem after the First Crusade in 1118. They set up shop in the Holy Land and all over Europe, protecting the routes to and from Jerusalem under the command of the Pope. They became extremely rich and powerful from their exploits, and possessed all sorts of artifacts, artworks, and precious objects from the Holy Land, and were even rumored to have found items like the Holy Menorah, Ark of the Covenant, and the Holy Grail while tunneling around the Temple Mount. But after their forced disbandment in 1312, their riches and treasures were never recovered, and hundreds of monks were never accounted for or heard from again. There are many that say they escaped to the Americas and possibly even had trade routes that they had been traveling on since the 12th century. We know the Vikings arrived in Canada in the 11th century, and the colonies in Greenland weren't abandoned until the 15th century. So the Scandinavians, after the end of the Viking Age, were still traveling to and from the Americas on their longboats, and the Templar may have been traveling along with them. Let me show you. So the Templars were most primarily crusaders and protectors of the roads to Jerusalem, and they were also early bankers protecting the travelers' money. But secondarily to all that, they were seekers of wisdom and knowledge. They were considered monks as much as they were warriors, and pursued knowledge of the world and God as a monk does. They were Catholics, serving under the Pope, and they received teachings from the Cistercians, a group of monks founded in 1098 that had monasteries all over Europe during the time of the Templar. A monk by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a cousin to one of the original 9 founding members, wrote to them many texts teaching them the ways of Christian mysticism and the pursuit of enlightenment. This philosophy led them to do things like collect books and texts, and store them in huge libraries and search for rare and even holy relics. Their journeys would have brought them some of the rarest texts of their time, ancient Roman works, medieval Hermetic texts, and even stories of people traveling to the Americas. One of which would have been the Viking sagas, telling of Leif Erikson's journey to Vinland. But there's others as well. If you watch this channel, you might be thinking about the video I did a few weeks ago about St. Brendan's journey into the Atlantic off the coast of Ireland in the 6th century. I'll link that video below, but the Templar would have absolutely heard this story. The Cistercian monks operating in Ireland would have been the ones to copy this text down and distribute it at the time. But not only that, the Templars' exploits in the Holy Land would have put them in contact with Islamic thinkers and writers, who historians are pretty certain had advanced maps. In 1513, the Ottomans gave us the Piri Reis map, said to be an amalgamation of earlier maps that have been lost to us. But these earlier maps most likely existed among these Islamic scholars in places like Damascus, Cairo, and Jerusalem. If the Templar had something like the Piri Reis map, they could have literally seen the Americas, where it was and how far it was. But there's one more thing. This may sound a little out there and it's mostly speculation, but there is some evidence that may support it. First off, the Templar were in contact with Marco Polo. He lived at the same time from 1254 to 1324 in Venice, one of many cities where the Templar operated from. But that's not the crazy part. Marco Polo may have been told about the Americas during his travels in Asia. When Marco Polo was in China, he visited many great cities and was told of the surrounding regions by people like Kublai Khan. He was told of Japan and Siberia and Indonesia, and all of the lands that were known to the people in Asia. He visited one city called Kinsay that he noted as being the most magnificent of anywhere on Earth. It was an island city in the middle of a huge lake, with a huge number of bridges connecting it to land. We're told this is a city in China, but on every old map it's depicted on, it's up north of Japan towards Siberia. Not only that, but on these old maps it also shows cities and inhabitants over in Alaska. If Marco Polo's story of visiting Kinsay was true, then such an advanced city would have no trouble reaching Alaska by sailing the Bering Strait. Based on these old maps, there were similar cultures on both sides of the strait, and we can see evidence of this today. The Native Americans all have DNA that originated from this region of Siberia and Mongolia, and you can see the resemblance. Not only that, but the cultures and languages are the same. There's a region of Siberia where the people known as the Ket live, and their language is directly related to languages spoken among Native Americans. And just look at the similarity in lifestyles. Nomadic, living in yurts or teepees. This migrating from the Siberian, Mongolian, and northern Chinese region was definitely going on 10,000 years ago, so why could it not have been continuing? The people of China at this time had huge boats. These were the ships Kublai Khan used to invade Japan in 1274. The Chinese also knew about this land to the east from their mythological stories. They had histories no doubt going back to the time when the Bering Strait land bridge was exposed in 10,000 BC. I have a video covering one of these Chinese voyages and I'll link that below, but their mythologies claim there was a sacred land to the east of them where the 8 immortals resided in their great golden temples, and they said a giant tree grew there, the largest on earth, known as the Fusang. The people here practiced Taoism in its original form and had extraordinarily long lifespans. But let's get back to the Templars. So Marco Polo would have been sharing his stories in the 13th and 14th century with the rich and powerful among the Venetians, and the Templar were among these aristocrats and kings. So they knew about China and Japan, and the regions further to the east where people had been migrating to for thousands of years. And they knew about Saint Brendan, the man who traveled west of Ireland, only to find a holy land filled with fruits and new trees and great rivers. They even may have seen the predecessor maps that Piri Reis used when making his legendary map that shows the Americas in 1513. And their relationship with the Scandinavians would have given them routes directly to Canada. The Viking age had ended, but the Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish people were still very much active with different kings ruling the regions. They had also been Christianized at this point, but had a complicated relationship with the authority of the Pope, making them a trustworthy ally for the Templar when the Pope turned on them. And we can find Templar symbols hidden among runestone carvings at Viking churches from the time period. We even have a Norwegian king, Sigurd I, who not only sent warriors to join the First Crusade, but also traveled to Jerusalem shortly after their victory as a pilgrimage. He traveled along the same trade routes Phoenicians would have taken thousands of years prior in his Viking longships. King Sigurd in the 12th century would have known full well of Leif Erikson's travels 100 years prior. All the people of Norway and Scandinavia would have heard the stories. And he was in the Holy Land shaking hands with the Templars. This King Sigurd I may have even been to Greenland or Vinland. Most likely not, but he no doubt received traded goods coming from these colonies. Like I said before, the Greenland colony was inhabited until the 15th century. And we don't know when the Vinland colony was abandoned, but it could have been in use for hundreds of years, well into the time of the Templar. So if the Templar did travel to the Americas, whether to bring hordes of treasure or to escape the Pope, what mark did they leave? We know the Viking colonies left behind goods all over the region through trade with natives. But is there evidence of Templar exploration in Native American artifacts? This is where it gets crazy. So first off, we have the Mi'kmaq tribe flag, which many have pointed out as a mirror image of a Templar battle flag. Weird enough. Actually, one theory goes that the Native Americans on the East Coast recognized this red cross symbol very well. Saint Brendan, the Irish monk, his vessel is depicted with a red Celtic cross. Viking travelers had their big red striped sails, and by the time of Christianization were adorned in crosses. And the bright red Templar cross on a white background would have made quite an impression. And the theory goes that this was why Columbus chose to adorn his ships in red crosses on the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Then there is the Mississippian connection. The Mississippians were the mound builder tribes that lived throughout the US, mostly around the Great Rivers from the years 880 to 1600s. They basically built pyramids all up and down the Mississippi. And we find weird artifacts at all their sites. The Templar cross, the Ouroboros symbol, Hamza symbol, and even the swastika are all found among these artifacts. All of which would have been commonly used among Viking and Templar. And then of course there were the many runestones found throughout the Americas. which are often said to be not in the original runic language, but in some kind of coded runic language, with symbols found nowhere else. Some have theorized the Templar had a hand in creating this new runic language. Symbolism and coded messages were a major part of Templar communication, especially after their order was made illegal. They, like many secret societies who often claimed to be successors of the Templar, used symbols as a way to communicate messages in secret. With their knowledge of the occult meaning behind these symbols, they created a secret language. Maybe this is where so many Native American tribes picked up their seemingly occult knowledge that goes all the way back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. And maybe the Templar treasures exist somewhere in the New World and not the Old. If the Templar did influence the Mississippians, they would have also influenced others in the Americas. The Aztec were in the midst of their multi-century long migration from their original homeland of Aztlan at this time. Nobody knows exactly where this land was, but we do know the Aztec traveled all throughout the Americas, along with some other tribes as well, sent by their head god until they found an eagle eating a serpent, a symbol that itself has deep occult meaning. But we know the Aztecs were in contact with the Mississippians because we've found Aztec relics in places like Illinois. The idea here being that the Templar joined the Aztecs on their great migration to find their promised land, a sentiment that was one of the founding tenets of being a Templar. Sometime in the 13th century, the Aztec did find their homeland, and upon building it, they created an artificial island on a great lake, just like they said their homeland of Aztlan looked. And in the center of this island, they created Templo Mayor, a huge pyramid with a double apex, a symbol that represented duality and the two chief gods, something that seems eerily similar to one of the Templar's most important symbols, the two riders on one horse. And on top of that, we can see the site had a huge amount of occult symbolism, harkening back to something out of Egypt or Mesopotamia, like the Great Pyramids or the Temple of Solomon. But is any of this provable? Well, many have speculated that the Aztec did meet some European people, mainly because their god Quetzalcoatl was said to be a white-skinned, bearded man. When Cortez arrived in Mexico, Montezuma actually thought this was the gods returning. There's also the question of where the Aztec got so much occult knowledge from Egypt and Mesopotamia and the like. We again find the Ouroboros symbol. And here's another symbol from the coat of arms in the 14th century that matches Aztec artworks. And of course the use of pyramids and snakes. But we have no answer for this. Perhaps they got it from the east when they migrated across the Bering Strait, or wherever else their original homeland of Aztlan may have been. As for the Mississippians and other tribes having met the Templars, this one is more likely, but still we have very little evidence. These symbols on the Mississippian artifacts are definitely super weird though. How would they have possibly had all these symbols represented? And why was the Templar cross on so many of their relics? It just doesn't make sense. But what I'm absolutely sure of is that the Templar heard these stories from Marco Polo, the Viking sagas, and St. Brendan, and knew there was something out there to the west. This was exactly why Columbus sailed west. And the Vikings were literally in America at the time of the Templars. There's no question of that. So yeah, I think it's very possible that the Templars made the trip. But all we can do now is keep looking for more evidence. And maybe, someday, we'll find it. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, here's 2 more up on screen you can check out. You can also go to our Patreon where you can watch these videos ad-free. I'll see you guys next time.